This Saturday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 6:30 p.m. Central Time, we have a historic SEC matchup on our hands, where for the first time in the regular season since 2020, and in the first time in the regular season since 2007, if you don't want to count the COVID year, the Georgia Bulldogs are traveling to Bryant-Denny Stadium to take on the Alabama Crimson Tide. Both teams are 3-0. Georgia is ranked number 2. Alabama is ranked number 4. And what makes this matchup historic is not just the fact that it's a top 5 matchup between the two most talented programs in the country per the 24/7 Sports Team Talent Composite, and also the fact that Alabama is 39-6 since 2021, and Georgia is 45-2 since 2021. Georgia with 2 national championships and an SEC championship. Alabama with a national championship game appearance and 2 SEC champions. There is more that makes this historical, and that's the fact that Nick Saban is only a few months in his retirement, and his greatest protege, his greatest apprentice, is Kirby Smart, and he will be taking his Georgia Bulldogs on the road to play against Nick Saban's successor, Kalen DeBoer, who I think has proven himself to be a top 5 head coach with what he did at Washington, Fresno State, the fact that he basically carried Tom Allen at Indiana, and what he did with Michael Penix, and so far what he's done not only on the recruiting trail, but also with Jalen Milroe and how I think this Alabama team is better than last year's Alabama team. So that makes this a historic matchup. You got Nick Saban's greatest protege facing up against Nick Saban's successor. You could say it's a battle between the Saban family. You could say that. And before we dive into this and I give you my preview and prediction, I want you watching, yes you, to like the video, to subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new college football content, and also when we do our giveaway once we reach 20,000 subscribers or 1,000 views on a video, whichever comes first, and we'll do a giveaway for both. Share this video around to other college football fans who enjoy the sport, who are passionate about it, invested in it, and again, like, sub, hit the bell. All of that helps the channel reach more viewers, earn more money, which we reinvest into the show. And comment your thoughts, your prediction, and your preview for this game down in the comment section below. And also check out my Patreon page and our Discord server. Please, more than the Patreon page or most things I mentioned, join the Discord server. You can find the Discord server and Patreon page links via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. But let's dive into this matchup. Again, Georgia is a 2-point road favorite, which is very intriguing for some things that we will get into in a few minutes. A hint, by the way, that Alabama is rated higher in some metrics, and they're at home, and Bryant-Denny Stadium is probably closer to a touchdown and point value than the typical 3-point value assigned to home field advantage, and yet Georgia is favored. And I think part of it is because, you know, it's only 2 points. So basically, if you pick Alabama to cover the Georgia spread, you're either a psycho and think that Georgia will win by 1, which is possible, or they win by 2 and no bets are lost or won, or you're just picking Alabama to win straight up. So it's a very close game, pretty close to a pick'em, I think, is viewed by this spread. And also the fact that there was a lot more preseason faith in Georgia, and Georgia profiled as the far superior team in the preseason. And now that we've gotten through a few games, these teams have looked fairly similar. But granted, they have not played even close to what will be their toughest competition. Their toughest competition will be each other in this game, or maybe Georgia playing Texas, or maybe Georgia playing Ole Miss. Alabama, they have to play Tennessee. Georgia also has to play Tennessee. So there are tougher games ahead for both of these schools, not just the one that is hitting them both in the face this Saturday in Week 5. Let's look at these teams from a bird's eye view. Let's look at the forest, then we'll get into the trees, the animals, the moss, the rocks, the streams, all the little details a part of the beautiful forest, the beautiful ecosystem that are each of these football teams. But broadly speaking, Alabama is viewed as the better football team in most power ratings. Georgia is viewed as 24 points better than the average college football team in FPI. Alabama is viewed as 28 points better than the average team in FPI. So per FPI, Alabama is 4 points better than Georgia is on a neutral field. You look at SP Plus from Bill Connolly, which I personally prefer, but it's still early in the season. Alabama is viewed as 30.7 points better than the average college football team in FPI. Georgia is viewed as 29.9 points better than the average college football team in FPI. So Alabama is about viewed as a point, if you want to be exact, 0.8 points better than Georgia in S&P Plus. And yet, remember, home field advantage typically is 3 points, though that's mostly used for the NFL, where home field advantage, if all the stadiums are filled, is much closer together than in college, where Northwestern's current mock high school stadium by Lake Michigan is not going to have the same effect on teams as the Horseshoe, Ohio Stadium, or Beaver Stadium, or Bryant-Denny Stadium, Sanford Stadium, Michigan Stadium. You get the whole point. Those stadiums that I just mentioned, like for Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Alabama, Georgia, LSU, etc., in my mind, they'd be closer to that 7-point addition, where I think if you play in those stadiums, however many points you're favored by, from a raw neutral field perspective, you ought to subtract 5, 6, or 7 points off of that and add it to the home team if they're, Alabama or Ohio State, for example. And it's the same thing with Georgia as well. So the fact that Alabama here, really per FPI, let's just, for the sake of argument, add only 3 for home field advantage, be a little conservative. The fact that per FPI, factoring in home field advantage, Alabama would be projected to win by 7, or in S&P Plus projected to win by about 3-4 points, and yet Georgia is favored by 2, is something that does strike me a little bit as odd, only from the numbers, but I get it, because as I'll discuss, Kirby Smart is right now college football's #1 head coach. Georgia, I think, had more of an off game against Kentucky rather than showing true major weaknesses that make them a non-top 5 team, because if Georgia has the same issues they did against Kentucky consistently, they may not even be a top 10 team. I mean, that was an ugly performance, about as ugly, I'd say uglier even, than Alabama's performance against South Florida, which just a few weeks ago, Alabama was only winning at one point 14-13, and then they pulled away. The final score is 42-16. And the final score is a lot more deceiving than the actual result of the game, where South Florida could have pulled ahead and won in late third, early fourth, mid-fourth quarter. A broad team comparison, again, let's continue with this. Georgia only has about a 0.293 points per play margin, which means on an average basis, Georgia scores 0.293 more points per play than their opponent. For Alabama, they score 0.64 more points per play than their opponents do, again, on an average basis. Like, Alabama scored a lot more points per play, more than Wisconsin, than they did compared to South Florida. So this all is on an average basis, and I get these from TeamRankings.com, who unfortunately does not factor in FCS opponents into this. Otherwise, Georgia would be much higher, because they scored 45 points against Tennessee Tech in their other 2 games against Kentucky and Clemson. Kentucky has some pretty good players on defense. I think a good defense overall, just a horrific offense. Clemson against Georgia looked like they had a horrific offense, really good defense. Now I don't know about that, but I think the Clemson-Georgia game tells us more that Georgia's defense is just closer to its 2021 and 2022 self than the fact that Clemson's offense is still terrible, because you can say NC State's bad, you can say App State's bad, and they are, but the efficiency they've had on offense, the Clemson Tigers, against those 2 teams is impressive, and I think that's a big resume boost for Georgia and their defense. But regardless, you look at the offenses and points per play margin. It says something about defenses, but it also says a whole lot about offenses. You can see here that Alabama, in their first 3 games, has had a tendency to score a lot more points than Georgia has. Alabama also has more drives produced per game than Georgia does. Georgia likes to go, I think, at a little bit of a slower pace, though DeBoer's not known for, trying to create as many possible possessions per game. But Georgia certainly is the more conservative team, more ball control, bully ball type team compared to Alabama, at least in theory. Alabama's done a pretty good job of controlling games. They've been very impressive at running the football, of bullying their opponents. They're really good in the trenches. Georgia has also controlled games fairly well. Clemson and Tennessee Tech, not so much against Kentucky. I watched that game live, and it was shocking how many third downs Kentucky was able to convert, how they were eventually wearing down that Georgia defensive front with an offensive line that just looked like, quite frankly, dog poop against South Carolina. South Carolina has a very legit defensive line. It's something that in the preseason I was shocked about when looking at their defensive tackle room and how good they were there. But that's really the only part of South Carolina that is extremely threatening to teams that are good, is that defensive line. Everything else can be moved around. And therefore, you look at the fact that, Kentucky got dominated by that South Carolina team and how they did against Georgia. That's the only reason their game control is not inside the top 10. They're 12th in game control per ESPN. They have the 43rd toughest strength of schedule. Bama has the 114th toughest strength of schedule. That's because Wisconsin is not viewed as a even top half team in all of college football. You look at the Power 4, Wisconsin's viewed as a bottom tier, below average Power 4 team per power ratings and all those different metrics. I mean, they have not been impressive. They've let Western Michigan, South Dakota, and Alabama run on them, I believe, each for over 100 yards. They have not had a single game where they've looked dominant, and their quarterback, Tyler Van Dyke, is also out for the season, which is tragic. I pray and hope that he heals up. Alabama smoked that Wisconsin team on the road, and that was kind of put in a comparison to Georgia against Kentucky that same week. And I get it, but it's not exactly fair either when Georgia opened up against Clemson neutral field and just blew them out. And Clemson is probably better than any other opponent that these two schools have played, until, of course, they play each other. And speaking of playing each other, I think the critical matchup in this game is Georgia's defensive line, their linebacker room, their DBs, really their defense, but focusing on the rushing defense to stop Alabama's powerful rushing offense. Alabama right now is one of the better rushing attacks in all of the country, and it is because they have an offensive line that, when healthy, is really, really good. They have one of the best, if not the best, starting 5 offensive linemen in all of college football. They're up there with Texas. They're, at this point, better than Georgia. Part of that is because some injuries that Georgia has played, that has suffered on the offensive line, and also how they've played on the offensive line this season. But Georgia's offensive line is still one of the best, and could be the best at the end of the country. But Alabama's offensive line, when it's healthy and when all their starters and best players are out there, is just, it's phenomenal. It's a really good unit. And behind them, they have Jam Miller, Justice Haynes. Jalen Milroe has been a very effective scrambler. He looks better as a runner than he did last year, obviously better as a passer. And look, Jaden Roberts, Parker Brailsford, Tyler Booker, Caden Proctor, Elijah Pritchett, Wilkin Formby, and that offensive line, Pritchett being better than Formby, but I don't know if Pritchett's fully healthy yet. I think they're just kind of trying to keep him in the reserves and keep him from getting injured further, is really, really good. And Alabama has been rushing for close to 6 yards per carry this season. Again, they have not played a defense like Clemson or like Michigan or Iowa, Ohio State, or Georgia. They have not played a caliber of defense like that. They haven't even played a caliber of defense like Texas, Texas A&M, or trying to think of another defense like Penn State's, for example, or there are probably other defenses like Miami's that are really good. But still, 714 yards rushing on the year, 5.9 yards per carry, 13 rushing touchdowns, 6 of them from Milroe, 5 of them from Justice Haynes and Jam Miller. Haynes and Miller, by the way, are averaging 9.1 for Miller and 8.7 yards per carry, respectively. And Milroe has had negative 44 sack yardage. So if you take the sacks away, and I think sack yardage should be an entirely different statistic, that way it makes it easier, to measure how a quarterback does in the pocket and how the offensive line's doing at protecting him. And just don't factor in sack yardage to rushing yards. It doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't compute. You take that out, Alabama's rushing for over 6 yards per carry, which is just, it's insane. It's very, very impressive what Alabama's offensive line has been able to do. They're well conditioned, and that combined with the running backs, Jalen Milroe, who at quarterback has a 213.4 passer rating, 8 touchdowns, no interceptions, completing 67% of his passes, 590 passing yards, over 11 yards per pass attempt. He's much better as a passer, which means he's going to do a better job of keeping defenses honest. That plus a ground game that is even further improved off of late 2023 Alabama's rushing attack, which was deadly, is going to be a problem for Georgia's defense. However, Georgia's defense is specialized, I think, in stopping the ground game. Their defensive line, I think, this year has looked better than last season. They only allow 3.2 opponent yards per rush attempt, which is 27th nationally. Kentucky did a very good job of, dominating time of possession and forcing punts. So they were able to wear down Georgia's defensive line a bit, but Georgia did very well against Tennessee Tech and Clemson in stopping the run. And it's not like Kentucky ran all over them. Kentucky didn't even run for close to 5 yards per carry, and I think just under 4 yards per carry. They ran for mid-threes, just enough to convert and extend drives, but not enough to really gash Georgia or get into the end zone. Georgia, they overall on defense are top 9 in yards per game. They only allow 236 yards per game. They're 6th in opponent yards per play, allow 3.6 yards per play. And they're 4th right now in opponent points per game and 5th in opponent points per play and 3rd in opponent yards per point. Offenses have to go 31.5 yards to get a single point on Georgia, which is just crazy dominant. I know, again, it's early in the season, but looking at how Clemson's done on offense, the fact that Kentucky is not good, but it's not like they're an FCS team, and they took care of Tennessee Tech like Georgia takes care of FCS schools. Make sure you score 30, 40 points in them and then get checked out and get ready for future weeks, future opponents. It's very impressive in my mind, Georgia's defense has been. And Georgia's defense, Michael Williams, if he is back and if he's healthy, Nazir Stackhouse, Christian Miller, Warren Brinson, Chaz Chambliss, C.J. Allen, Smile Munden Jr., and Malachi Starks, Dan Jackson, Dalen Everett, Julian Humphrey, Ojonel Aguero. All of those defensive players are going to have to put up a great effort to shut down Alabama's rushing attack because if you shut down Alabama's rushing attack and force them to exclusively pass, that is Georgia's path to victory, in my mind. Meanwhile, for Alabama, if Alabama can run on Georgia, limit Georgia's possessions, and if Alabama runs very effectively, they won't need to maximize possessions in order to score. They'll just be able to score. They'll be able to control the game and dictate it on their own terms, sort of like what Kalen DeBoer's Washington did against Oregon last year in the Pac-12 championship game. They just ate up TOP. They were able to stay on schedule in the run game, also in the pass game, hitting some explosives, and stay consistently enough to head to where they came out with the victory. I imagine that's what Alabama wants to do, except they don't have the same passing offense that Washington did last year, but they do have a way better rushing offense. So look for the Tide to run the ball a lot, and look for Georgia to try anything and everything possible to really limit Alabama's rushing attack and dare Jalen Milroe to throw in the direction of Dalen Everett and Malachi Starks, who are some of the best defensive backs in all of college football. Offensively, I think that I would give Bama the edge overall. Quarterback's a little bit of a push, and I say that because, well, I think Jalen Milroe gives you the better toolkit to win in today's college football. He's very mobile, very athletic. Carson Beck has some athleticism, but he's not even close to a dual threat QB. And you want a dual threat QB. You want an athletic QB. I mean, that is the path in my mind to maximizing your team's success. You know, you have Joe Burrow and you have Mac Jones and you have Bryce Young, who, by the way, was athletic. You have C.J. Stroud, who was athletic but just didn't want to use his legs. J.J. McCarthy last year was pretty athletic. Joe Burrow and Mac Jones were not exactly known, for Mac Jones at least, to be athletes. But Burrow had scrambling yards. He could move. He could extend drives. Same with all the other quarterbacks I mentioned, really outside of Mac Jones, who I think it's been proven he was a product of Steve Sarkisian's system, elite wide receivers like Devonta Smith, and just one of college football's best supporting casts on offense in the sport's history. Beck has not thrown a single interception either, just like Milroe hasn't. Beck has 680 passing yards on 82 attempts, 7 touchdowns, a 166.1 passer rating. So far this year, he has not been an elite QB. He's 12th in QBR, but 12th is great. And I bet you that his QBR is actually underrated because Georgia's played a tougher strength of schedule. As I documented earlier, when they have a top 100 strength of schedule, a lot of these really good teams like Alabama and Ohio State don't have a top 100 strength of schedule. They haven't really played anyone who is of respectable Power 4 caliber yet. Georgia has. Georgia's played Kentucky, who is maybe just as good as Wisconsin. I'd say Wisconsin's better than Kentucky, but we don't know, and they don't play each other, at least for now. Clemson's way better than anyone, for example, that Ohio State's played, better than anyone that Alabama's played. They may be better than anyone Texas has played. Texas could be better than Michigan. Clemson could be better than Michigan. Obviously, Texas is better than Michigan. I could be wrong on that front, but we're very early in the season, so I'm willing to speculate and say that maybe Clemson's better than Michigan. Don't personally think that, but Carson Beck's played some pretty good defenses. He's been in some tough games, and last season he was very successful. Had a 167.9 passer rating, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, completed over 70% of his throws, and averaged 9.5 yards per pass attempt. And I think that these two quarterbacks are pretty, just on an overall basis, obviously their skill sets are very different. Beck's a better passer. Milroe's a much better scrambler. Milroe has a much higher ceiling, but also I'd say a much lower floor. Beck is more so, you know what's coming in that sense. Milroe's more unpredictable. But in terms of what they give these teams and the edge they give one team over another, I'd give it a push. I don't know who's the better quarterback right now. I don't. I would take Milroe, but that's just me. I personally like dual threat athletic quarterbacks more so than I do quarterbacks like Beck, who couldn't run for 100 yards in a game without some insane, insane play happening, like a busted play by a defense. But outside of that, I'd take Bama at running back, wide receiver, guard, and center, the interior of the offensive line. I would take Georgia at tackle and also at tight end. Georgia right now has a tight end in Lawson Lucky, who has 4 receptions for 80 yards and a touchdown. And then we all know about Oscar Delp, who has 3 receptions for 25 yards, no touchdowns just yet. But Georgia's a very talented tight end room. And at offensive tackle, they have Xavier Truss and Ernest Green III, who are future NFL offensive tackles. And for Georgia, they have Trevor Etienne, who's 157 rushing yards and 24 carries, no touchdowns and 6.5 yards per carry. And they have Branson Robinson and Nate Frazier as well. But yet again, Alabama has Jam Miller and Justice Haynes. And they're averaging close to 9 yards per carry. Jam Miller just a little over. Justice Haynes just a little under. And Alabama's rushing attack is awesome, and a lot of it is because of that offensive line, where especially on the interior, they've been productive. And the only reason I'm taking Georgia right now at tackle over Bama is because I don't know exactly the health situation of Alabama's offensive tackles, and also the fact that Milroe has been sacked way more than Beck has with fewer passing attempts. So I think that right there shows that Georgia does have the better pass protection on the offensive line. As for run blocking, and maybe some of it is just because Alabama has the far better running back room, but typically it's the offensive line that makes the run game, not the running backs who do. I would take Alabama on the interior of the lines. I would take them at wide receiver, where Ryan Williams, who was born the last time these two schools met in 2007 in Bryant-Denny Stadium, in a non-COVID year, that is. I know they met in 2020. Ryan Williams, he has 285 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, or 10 receptions, 4 receiving touchdowns. He's really, really good. And then they have Jeremy Bernard, Kobe Prentice, Caleb Odom, Kendrick Law, Emmanuel Henderson Jr. Georgia has Dominic Lovett and Arian Smith, who are the only receivers over 100 yards. They each have 1 receiving touchdown. And they also have Dylan Bell, London Humphreys, Colby Young. Georgia does have a deep receiver room, but I think Alabama's, especially when they're coached by Jamarcus Shepard, is a little bit different and in a good way. Defensively, I would take Georgia on the defensive line. I would take them at cornerback with Dalen Everett, where Alabama's playing a lot of young players. Safety's a push because Georgia has Malachi Starks. Malachi Starks this season has the team's only interception, and he also has 11 total tackles. But Alabama, they have Keon Sabb, and they also have Malachi Moore, who's returned for, his 4th year in a row or so. Keon Sabb has 3 passes defended, 2 interceptions. Malachi Moore has 2 passes defended and a forced fumble. I think the safety room is very competitive. Georgia probably has slightly better depth if you look at the second stringers, but starters, I'd take the Crimson Tide slightly, so I give that a push. Defensively, on the D-line, when healthy, Georgia is better and more talented, both at the NFL level and also, I think, the recruiting level too, compared to Alabama. And at linebacker, Deontay Lawson and Jihad Campbell have both graded out as crazy high linebackers, both easily top 100, top 50 or top 25 actually, in all of college football pro football focus. And Georgia's are good, but I think Alabama's are just a notch higher. These teams defensively so far on the year, Alabama has 7 sacks, 2 picks, 21 passes defended, and 4 forced fumbles. Georgia has 8 sacks, a pick, 6 passes defended, and 3 forced fumbles. I think in the trenches, I'd give it to Georgia just slightly, but Alabama's very close behind. I think Alabama has the better offensive line. Georgia has the better defensive line. It's pretty close, and I considered saying it was a push, but I got to give it to Georgia because their offensive line is closer to Alabama's offensive line than Alabama's D-line is as close to Georgia's D-line. Special teams, though, I'd give absolutely to the Crimson Tide. They have one of the better special teams units in all of college football, with a great punter, great kicker, and also impressive return specialist. So that leads me to my prediction. But before I get to that, I do want to say these are some of the best staffs in all of college football. Kirby Smart, I think, is the better head coach, and I think he has the better defensive staff. I would give Alabama the offensive staff, though, and also strength and conditioning. They don't just have Alabama's strength and conditioning coach under Nick Saban. They also brought in Kalen DeBoer's strength and conditioning coach at Washington. So you have 2 elite Power 4 level strength and conditioning coaches in the same room. That, I think, makes for the best strength and conditioning room in all of the country. And Georgia's can contend for that, but I would just side with Alabama just a little bit there. My prediction for this game is I think Alabama covers. I do think that they win by a score of 27-20. The reason I'm going with Alabama here is primarily because, well, it's hard to win in Bryant-Denny Stadium. That's really what it comes down to, if I'm being honest. And also the fact that based off of the Kentucky game, just a little bit, I think that Alabama will be able to move Georgia's defensive line. Not move as in average 5 or 6 yards per carry, but they have an impressive rushing attack. and a really good offensive line. And I'm excited to see what this game brings. And I think that it wouldn't be a shock at all if Georgia were to come in here and win. After all, they are favored. It wouldn't be a shock if Alabama were to win. This is pretty close to a coin flip game, but I like Alabama being dynamic at quarterback. Their offensive line is really good. Their running back room is. They really do have like a three-headed monster in the ground game, and their defense has improved, I think, compared to last year. I think on all fronts, Alabama is a better team than they were last year. It's not extreme or excessive improvement, except for offense. I think they're much better on offense. They're pretty similar on defense and special teams, maybe a little bit better. What you have to remember is last year, despite the fact that Alabama, played in the college football playoff and won the SEC, Georgia was much better in power ratings. Like, in my mind, it was clear that Georgia was better last year. But that's why you play the games, because the best team overall does not always win. The best team overall is not always the best team on any given Saturday. So that's why you play the games. And it very well could be that the team who wins this game is not the best out of these two teams, especially if Alabama beats Georgia, because it's on the road, and Bryant-Denny Stadium is a very, very tough place to win. So that, along with the fact that I think Alabama is currently the more dynamic team, Georgia clearly missed Brock Bowers and also Ladd McConkey, and their defense, I need to see them play an offense like Alabama's before I can say they're at a 2021 or 2022 Georgia level. So I got Alabama covering and winning 27-20. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman members and sponsoring this video and channel. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connolly OH, Ismar, Tyler 9, Chilton Cush for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video as all-conference members. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the links in the description and down below in the pinned comment. Have a great night. Go Bulldogs, and go Crimson Tide.